Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to listeners from across the globe to this sponsored DevEx webinar, a new paradigm for capacity development. My name's Richard Jones, Associate Editor for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa at DevEx, and I'll be your moderator today. Our presenters today are from Deloitte Consulting, LLP. Wendy Carr, who leads Deloitte's work in institutional strengthening and capacity development in emerging markets, and Molly Loomis, who's an international public health and organizational development manager in Deloitte's emerging markets practice. Welcome to Wendy and Molly, and we look forward to hearing from you shortly. Before we launch into presentations, discussion, and take your questions, I'd just like to say a few brief words of background on today's topic. The post-2015 development agenda, the follow-up framework to the Millennium Development Goals, emphasizes sustainability and local ownership. This calls into question the development community's reliance on what Deloitte Consulting LLP have described as an outdated capacity building paradigm, one based on individual training and skills building. Recognizing the lack of a clear, systematic way to build capacity, Deloitte adapted its commercial human capital practices and field-based experience to the unique global development context. The resulting approach, Cypress, which stands for Capacity, Performance, Results, Sustainability, provides a roadmap so that counterparts can focus on sustainable, measurable performance. But what have we learned from interventions so far? What successes have been achieved? And what can the global development community learn about making the shift from capacity building to sustainable performance improvement? What can practitioners do to make this paradigm shift the new normal? Capacity development and the Cypress methodology were the subject of an article featured on DevEx earlier this month. That was entitled, "Forget Capacity Development, Focus on Sustainable Performance Improvement." Now, we'll put the link to this article in the chat box shortly, and we'd encourage you to take a look and then have your say following today's webinar. So without further ado, let me hand you over to today's presenters from Deloitte Consulting LLP, Wendy Carr and Molly Loomis. Wendy and Molly, you're here to talk about a unique perspective on capacity development. Where did that perspective originate?
Consulting for over 25 years, and I spent most of my career consulting in U.S. federal government agencies. But when I shifted to doing international development work about 10 years ago, what I noticed is that there's a lot of the same problems that are faced in organizations. So how to develop organizations and their workforce so that they can perform effectively. But certainly the circumstances in the development context are very unique. But domestically, there's a host of human capital solutions that are brought to bear to address some of these issues. And what I noticed is that a lot of these solutions are largely overlooked in the development context because they're not looking at the problems from a human capital lens. So what I wanted to do was try to adapt some of those commercial or U.S. human capital best practices and apply them into the context of international development. So for me, that's really where this idea sort of took root.
Thanks, Wendy. And this is Molly. I've been working in international development space for about 15 years, and when I look back at one of the formative steps in my capacity development career, it was actually my time as a swim team coach back in college. One thing that was very clear in this context was how we measured performance. What mattered most was how far and how fast each child could swim across that pool. And while people recognized my contribution in leadership as a coach, we all knew that it was really the swimmer that was in charge. They decided how much time they wanted to invest, how hard they wanted to train, and how fast they wanted to go. And when they improved their time over the course of the summer, they owned those results. And this is something that's really stuck with me as I've implemented different capacity development programs. My role as a coach and a supporter, and that ownership that the counterpart has over their program, and how important it is to be able to measure performance.
So essentially we've taken some of the lessons that Molly described and combined them with leading commercial approaches, and that is really creating the shift in how we deliver capacity development programs. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So perhaps now more than ever, there's a greater sense within the capacity development community that success depends on more than just capacity building. More often we hear words like outcome level change and strong leaders and local solutions, performance management, things like that when we're talking about capacity building. And these are all great things, and we're looking in a different direction and looking to achieve different results, and it's very exciting. But it's not exactly new either. There's definitely a cyclical nature of the capacity development priorities. So if we look back to the capacity development literature in the 90s, there's a demand to measure performance and stop focusing on process. And if we look back to the 70s, we're likely to see very much the same thing. So we've been here before, and we've recognized there's a disconnect. We've said these words, but in many ways we've failed to achieve them. So if you think about this, the question is really, why?
Well, I think in simplest terms, we're looking down one road while we drive down another. We know where we need to go, but the way that we design and implement and measure our capacity building programs force us down the same old path that we've been going down since the 70s. So let's imagine a typical program. We start with a scope of work and some targets that we're being held accountable to. And even though our scope is quite broad, our targets often focus on the numbers trained. So we tailor our work plans to accommodate all these trainings because that's what's in our contract, and that's how we'll demonstrate success. And we know it's important for our program to be participatory, so we engage our counterparts in a participatory self-assessment. They score themselves according to our tool, which is focused on our project topics, because that's what we care about. Based on those responses, we identify the areas where we need to build their capacity, and we design events and activities and deploy technical assistance to get things done. Because we need to make sure that they're able to engage in those events and activities, because that's what we're held accountable for, right? We provide transportation and per diem and other incentives to overcome barriers and increase their interest in attending. And while we recognize that the changes we're promoting will be difficult to maintain, we also realize that we're limited by time and resources and the scope of our project. We simply can't fix everything that needs to be fixed, so we prioritize. We know that leadership matters, so we engage them and communicate to them how important these capacity development activities are, and we make sure we get their approval for our activities. But when it comes to major decisions, we have to keep those for ourselves to make, because these decisions affect our ability to achieve our targets and be successful in our project. Does this sound familiar? Unfortunately, it probably does. So let's take a step back and look at the impacts of our decisions and actions. Because training is often the only thing we measure, that's what gets done. Since outcome indicators are rarely in our performance monitoring plans, we don't measure them. And that means that when we're asked for evidence demonstrating the value of our capacity development work, we can only point to numbers trained. We often assume that our counterparts share our mandate and that their participation in our program is furthering their goals and is therefore valuable to them. But we rarely ask about their end goals, so we don't actually know if we're working towards the same goals or not. And if we're not, then their participation in our program is just a distraction from their real focus, and our efforts are not likely to be sustained. We know that people value something if they've paid for it. Yet, not only do we rarely require an organization to invest in capacity building programs, we pay participants to attend these events. And in this widespread system that we've put in place, capacity building programs are now viewed as income generating activities for individuals rather than as a way to improve performance. So we've actually removed any intrinsic value of our capacity building programs. Because we reserve important decisions for ourselves, we're actually disempowering leaders, and we're creating a situation in which they can only have token ownership of our capacity building programs. Again, making it something that they're unlikely to sustain. And because we don't prioritize or allocate resources to change management, any changes our counterparts do are less likely to stick. So where does this lead us? Driving down the same old road, and every decision, every action, even if it seems rational at the time, is pushing us further away from our goal. And where do we end up? Well, we certainly do have our successes, and we like to showcase these successes. But many of these accomplishments are fleeting. More often, if we're honest with ourselves, and if we look back a few years after the project ends, what we see is stagnation and dependency, disengaged leaders and distrust, and we, as a community, are unable to demonstrate the value of what we've achieved. Our solutions are unsustainable, and when the project ends and the money runs out, things fall apart.
So based on the scenario that Molly described, you can see that we're at a crossroads. We have our frameworks and we have clear end goals that we want to achieve, but even though we know where we want to go and we may know what we need to do to get there, what we actually do undermines our ability to achieve those outcomes. So the question is, how do we get on the right path? Well, what we think is that we need to make some fundamental changes. We need to shift the paradigm in which we design, deliver, and evaluate capacity building programs. And those shifts really come in two different places. First, we need a shift in mindset in terms of the relationship and power dynamics between capacity building experts and our counterparts. But we also need a shift in focus from capacity building to sustainable performance improvement. And just as important, we need step-by-step methodologies that will operationalize these shifts and hold us accountable for the changes we know we need to make. And it's even more important that these shifts happen now. With the ongoing global financial crisis, that means there's ever fewer resources available, and we're under greater pressure to demonstrate measurable results with the resources we have. At the same time, we have new ways of looking at data to help us better tell the stories of our successes. And with the internet, social media, better and faster communication has increased connections between people around the world, creating a collective awareness of what's possible. So how do we get on this right path? Well, Deloitte has designed a new methodology to help us operationalize these paradigm shifts. Our methodology is called Cypress, which stands for Capacity, Performance, Results, and Sustainability, which are the four key themes of our approach. So the idea is that when you build capacity to drive or improve performance so that the results you achieve are sustainable. In this methodology, our counterparts are in the driver's seat. They own the process and they own the results. They're imagining their future, they're constructing a plan to move from their current state to the future state, and they're leading the implementation of that change. The most important thing about that this methodology accomplishes is that it aligns the capacity development interventions with the factors driving performance and goal achievement. So the result is that capacity building becomes a means to an end, not the end state. And the end state is sustainable performance improvement. So the steps of the methodology are pretty typical, and you'll see that in the diagram that's illustrated on the slide. But the magic is in the how. How is this methodology implemented, and the underlying principles that help us stay on the right path. So what we'd like to share with you today is some of these underlying principles of the Cypress methodology.
Thanks, Wendy. Our first principle is to begin with what the counterpart really cares about and what they're mandated to do. Deloitte's research shows that organizations that know their purpose generally outperform those that don't. When organizations set their own goals in the context of the capacity building program, they shift the ownership of the program in their direction. They also focus more on the things that ultimately matter, the performance outcomes, rather than the capacity outputs. In theory, this is great, right? But what does it look like in practice when we have a specific scope of work and we have limited resources? Well, I'll give you a few examples. We started a program in Afghanistan with a clear scope of work for a capacity building program with one of the government ministries. So we knew from the beginning what we were on the hook to achieve with our donors. But the first thing we did was ask our counterparts what their capacity development goals were. We captured these goals, and together we developed a strategy to achieve them. And these, rather than our original scope of work, define the activities that we would implement over the next year and a half. We took these goals and the strategy and the activity plan back to Deloitte's donor. And we were able to demonstrate that by focusing on our counterparts' performance targets, we would still be able to achieve our own project targets. And in fact, in the end, we exceeded them. We took a similar first step in Nigeria, where we worked with local government authorities. And they're often told by national or state governments what to do and when to do it, and they're generally given very few resources with which to do it. But just going through the process of defining their capacity development goals moved them into a position of greater empowerment and gave them a new sense of purpose. And I think the quote on this page says it all. We see what we can do for ourselves without waiting for the government. Our second principle is to make the current state assessment a learning event. Assessments should create a greater sense of self-awareness, but they must also define a clear path forward. We use the maturity model and benchmarking tool to help counterparts do both. Our tool consists of 11 different domains that cover 189 discrete parameters. This also includes a mission delivery domain that's tailored to specific industries. So an organization with a mandate to, say, reduce HIV transmission will have a different mission delivery domain than a tax administration agency. Based on the performance goals that the counterpart wants to achieve, they select the domains and parameters that are most relevant to the factors driving their performance. And the tool is performance-based. It doesn't focus on what the counterpart has. It emphasizes what they can do at each level of maturity, from basic to leading edge. And leading edge is truly leading edge from a global leader, top performer perspective. This is really important because it enables counterparts to see the possibilities for themselves and make their own informed decisions rather than relying entirely on the knowledge and guidance of the capacity development expert. And because they have the full picture, participants can drive the assessment discussion. They capture quantitative scores for their current and desired future states, and they justify their current state scores with concrete evidence to reduce the subjectivity of their assessment. They also capture gaps they need to address in order to move to their future state. And they can look to higher levels of maturity to determine what they need to do to address those gaps. This process allows them to easily transition from the assessment to the performance improvement work plan. And I think from my experience, that's one of the hardest transitions to make. So I'll share a few examples here as well. In our recent project in South Sudan, our counterpart had just received 4 new computers, more than any other government agency in the country. Because of this, they considered themselves to be leading edge. And they were, by their standards. But that's the challenge, right? Their frame of reference was pretty narrow, and they didn't know what was possible. Similarly, all of us often know what dysfunction feels like. We're always experiencing that. But few of us have had the pleasure of being in the leading edge. And without that frame of reference, it's hard to visualize what's possible and even harder to imagine how to get there. By using the maturity model and benchmarking tool, our counterparts in South Sudan broadened their perspective and were able to map out a path towards their future state, one that went beyond just having 4 computers. So we see with this clear spectrum of performance, our counterparts can more easily see where they are relative to the top and the bottom, and they understand what they need to do to move forward. They also begin to calibrate their self-perspective and become more objective in their analysis. What we saw in Afghanistan and Nigeria was a dip in assessment scores from the baseline to year 1. And our counterparts were quick to explain this. They said, we didn't know what we didn't know, and we weren't as good as we thought we were the first time we assessed ourselves. So even though we've definitely improved our performance from last year, our score is more accurate this year.
Thanks, Molly. So the third principle is equipping leaders with tools and knowledge to manage change. And we've really taken a hard look at this in Cypress because, as we all know, leaders are so important to successfully managing and leading well-functioning and high-performing organizations. So one of the things that we do in Cypress is we incorporate a tool that we call Empower, which is a leadership development approach that prepares senior and middle managers to take on the increasing responsibility that comes from ownership and to be successful in navigating change. So for example, in Egypt, for one of the ministries, we created a 2-tier leadership development program. One tier provided basic leadership skills to all of the supervisors and managers across the organization. And then there was a second-tiered program that people that were identified as future leaders had to be nominated into that was much more rigorous and prepared them to really achieve some of the higher-level senior positions in the organization. One of the other ways that we equip leaders is by focusing on change management. So it's well documented that a lot of large change initiatives fail when there's no attention paid to managing the change. In fact, there's an entire discipline on change management that helps to organizations to navigate these changes so that they run more smoothly. But it's rare that you see this emphasis placed in the development context, where in U.S. domestic programs it's largely brought to bear. So some of the ways that we incorporate change management into Cypress, how we've built it in, is that either formally or informally we help our counterparts think about change management strategically. So we do things like developing a stakeholder analysis where we help them identify all of the people that are impacted by what's going on in the organization and who those people are. So whether they are decision makers, whether they are influencers, and just how they should be involved in this overall initiative so that they know who to collaborate with and where to share information. We also help develop communications plans with the audiences that messages need to be distributed to, with the types of messages that need to go out, and who needs to deliver those messages. So as well as two-way communication that enables the counterparts to have a pulse on the organization as it's going through the changes. And then we also do change readiness assessments that evaluate whether organizations and the workforce are ready, willing, and able to make the change, and where those barriers of resistance might lie, and where those change enablers also lie, so that specific interventions can be developed to address those changes as needed. And the fourth and final principle that we want to share with you is about enabling counterparts to own their own results. Performance data and capacity data, when you combine those, can give an accurate picture of what's driving performance and whether capacity improvements are making a difference in performance. This helps us make the shift from capacity outputs to performance outcomes and helps us hold ourselves accountable. We do this in part by measuring the right things and in part by aligning our performance targets with performance targets of counterparts. So for example, in Nigeria, when we started our project, the M&E targets focused only on numbers trained. We recognized that our project needed to go beyond this, so we created a set of outcome-level capacity indicators and included them in our PMP, our project management plan. This changed the focus of our activities to performance improvement. Another example is in Kenya, where we helped institutionalize performance management within a parastatal agency so that they could measure their own performance over time. Several of our performance targets were tied to theirs, which meant that we had to go beyond putting a system in place. We had to help them identify and then address the factors that were driving their performance. And then finally, another example is in South Sudan, where we purposefully linked our own performance targets in our work plan to their performance metrics so that our success as a project depended on their success in achieving their mandates. And this is really what we're striving for as part of this paradigm shift.
We've implemented Cypress in a pretty wide range of countries and sectors and with a lot of different counterparts, ranging from very small NGOs and CSOs to very large governments to parastatals and private sector entities. And the topics have been quite varied as well. But across all of these projects, those four principles are really the foundation of what we do and how we do it. And it's those foundational principles that help us hold ourselves accountable to the performance changes and the paradigm shifts that we want to achieve. At the start of this presentation, we talked a lot about the many actions and decisions we make as capacity development programmers that undermine our ability to be successful. And we acknowledge the need for a paradigm shift. With Cypress, we've been able to shift the paradigm. And what we've seen is that when you shift the paradigm, you will achieve results. Since we've designed and piloted Cypress about 4 years ago, our counterparts have been achieving meaningful and measurable performance improvement. And this slide shows just a few. Revenue that they've generated, increased productivity, greater stakeholder satisfaction, more inputs in policy decisions and resource allocation decisions. These results tell a story, and they can demonstrate value in a way that numbers trained cannot.
So Cypress demonstrates that it's possible to shift the paradigm, and when you do, you get results. But how do we create a global paradigm shift that changes mindsets and puts our counterparts in the driver's seat, and that changes the lexicon away from capacity development and to sustainable performance improvement? So based on our experience implementing Cypress, we've identified a few things that we think will help drive the paradigm shift, shown here on the slide. But our question is, what do you think? And with that, we'd like to open it up to your questions.
A big thank you there to Wendy and Molly for their very insightful presentations. And indeed, it's now time to take some questions from you, today's webinar participants. And if you haven't yet submitted a question, remember that it's not too late please feel free to enter your questions using the chat box in the WebEx window. Now, to kick things off, Molly and Wendy, I was very interested to see there in the final slide the image of the highway and the signage mentioning factors like empowering counterparts, influencing stakeholders, creating resources for change management, and many others. I just wondered what your one piece of advice here to today's webinar listeners would be on the key step to creating a global paradigm shift from capacity development to sustainable performance. What would be the key step that you would recommend here today?
That's a difficult decision. We thought we were being pretty good just by breaking it down to 4 key steps. But from my perspective, I think that empowering our counterparts to lead the change is one of the most important things. If they're not leading it, then it's not going to be maintained. I don't know, Wendy, what you think is the most.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely important, and I would add to that, again, that making sure that the interventions that we're helping our counterparts implement are tied to their performance goals and what they're trying to achieve, so that the capacity development interventions are actually driving performance. So if you link those two things by empowering counterparts and then making sure that they're driving performance, that's where performance improvement becomes sustainable. And so that sort of brings it together.
Thanks both. And now we've got a good 20, 25, maybe even 30 minutes for some questions from you, the webinar participants, and do remember to keep them coming. There's been some excellent questions already, and we'll try to take as many as time allows today. Kicking off with one that we received earlier, Wendy and Molly, what are the most effective ways of measuring sustainable performance in government institutions where there's a high turnover of staff?
Thanks, Richard. That's a great question. And again, I think it's largely tied to what we just discussed. If you start with performance metrics that are tied to the mission and the goals that the organization is trying to achieve, then what you're measuring is really not reliant on who is in the organization. And so you set up a system that allows you to evaluate whether performance improvements are being sustained. But then you have to address some of the systemic issues that are causing high turnover and mitigate the risk of high turnover. So things like implementing ways of retaining knowledge in the organization, and that can be through standardization of processes and documentation of processes and things of that nature. And then also addressing issues of retention so that people remain resident.
Thanks, Wendy. I would add to that creating a culture of performance improvement is really important when there's high turnover. So one of the things that you could do, for example, is have a few very specific performance metrics that the entire agency is focused on and publish the results of those metrics on a monthly or a quarterly basis. And by keeping those performance metrics front and center, anyone who comes into the organization will see that that's what the organization cares about. So the turnover won't have as much of an effect because you're creating a culture that brings people along, no matter whether they're just starting yesterday or whether they've been there for a year or 10 years. It's more about the culture that's going to drive change and maintain that focus on performance.
No, thanks very much for that. Another question that we had in earlier today was what strategies are required for institutional strengthening and capacity development for local organizations and government institutions with very low management capacity? I wondered if you could speak to that question.
Sure, Richard, thanks. And, you know, this is a situation that I'm sure many of us have experienced where we're working with organizations with low management capacity. And as we were designing Cypress, it's one of the things that we really took into consideration And that's why we built in the component that focuses on leadership development as a strategy for performance improvement. So I talked a little bit about our leadership development approach that we call Empower, and we integrate that into our programs. But then we also identify ways for leaders to practice these skills. And one of the techniques that we use to do that is something that we call performance sprints. And what performance sprints are is that within your performance improvement plan that the counterpart has developed after understanding what their gaps are, you identify an initiative that they can work on to solve. And this isn't just any initiative. It's a high-impact, high-visibility initiative that solves a very intransigent and difficult problem that the organization faces that requires them to coalesce and work with a broad group of stakeholders and solve the problem in a very rapid time frame, like 90 days. And by working towards this objective, managers are required to demonstrate the management skills that they learned through any leadership development program. They're also required to demonstrate change management approaches that help bring the organization and all of the broad stakeholders along as they're solving the problem collectively. So that's a way to help bolster the management skills, but first, having a development program around that and identifying ways for them to practice executing those skills.
Wendy, I would add to that having something that I think is fairly simple, processes and structures around leadership roles and responsibilities. So having basic job descriptions about what the manager and leadership are meant to do versus other staff, that's really helpful, and it's something that the organization can point to when people go off track. Another thing that we can do to help managers is to create dashboards with the metrics that they need to be focused on. I think often as managers we get distracted sometimes with things that are not really part of our focus. And so having a dashboard with the 2 or 3 things that we need to focus on and that we're being held accountable for, that can help managers do their management job better.
Thanks very much. We've got questions coming in thick and fast here. Another listener's question is the following. He or she says, I'm interested in hearing about evidence-informed decision-making in resource-constrained areas, especially with regards to policy development or decision-making in public organizations. I just wondered whether you could speak to this topic, Wendy and Molly.
Yes, the evidence-based decision-making needs greater emphasis in enabling our counterparts to really use data. And this is particularly challenging in many environments where there aren't a lot of resources to produce the data. But, again, it all starts with establishing goals and metrics that focus on outcomes and not outputs, because it's the outcome level metrics that are really going to provide that evidence and give the insights that are needed to make those decisions. And then just start with collecting what data is available. So you might not have all the structures in place to collect everything that you need, but start with what's available and work with the counterparts to practice using data to gain insight, to understand how to analyze data to gain meaning, so that can contribute to decision making. And through this, you begin to identify the gaps in the data and put the measures in place to begin to collect that data that has previously not been available. And the experience is that once you start using data and once people get used to using data, they'll want more of it. It'll become a real tool that people rely on and start using. But the key is just to get it going with whatever resources are available and then work towards building those over time.
I think that one of the challenges we face about evidence-informed decision is that the evidence that we have is is often incomplete, as Wendy said, and sometimes it's not really good evidence. We can't rely on it. I hear that again and again. There's data, but I don't trust it. So I think another thing that we can do is put measures in place for better data quality control so that we know that what data we have is actually reliable data. And I agree with Wendy wholeheartedly. Once you start to look at data and use data, you create a culture of data use, and that becomes a vicious circle in a good way, where people are demanding more data. And the more data you have, the better decisions you can make, the more efficiencies you create, and then you have more resources to get even more data. So,
thanks for that. Thanks for that, Molly and Wendy. And another listener question that's just come in. The listener asks, can you talk about capacity development at different levels, i.e. individual, group, organization, community, and or institution, focusing on a particular level? Could you talk to that a little bit?
Sure. I think that a lot of the steps and the underlying principles are the same, whether you're working with an individual or a group or a community. The first thing to start with are those performance goals. What is it that they're concerned about? What are they being held accountable? What do they need to do? The second is an assessment, and the assessment tool will vary whether you're doing an individual level program or whether you're working with a group or a community or an institution. But making sure that that assessment shows them the full spectrum is really important, and making sure that there's a connection between the assessment tool that you're using and the performance that they want to improve is also very important, because that's what helps us tell that story, to say that this is the performance target and these are the performance gaps that we identify, and these are the capacity gaps that contribute to that performance gap, and so these are the capacity building interventions that we're going to do. That connection, that logical framework, is what we need to be able to say what we did make a difference.
And I would add to that just that the maturity model benchmarking tool that is the assessment tool that we highlighted in this presentation, we've applied it at all of these different levels that are described here. So we've done it at the organizational level, we've done it with a group within an organization, and we've also done it across a system. So a collective group of organizations that need to work together to achieve a common objective. And the tool works beautifully in all of those different scenarios. I think the other thing I would add is that when you're talking about the individual level, what you would need to do is then cascade the goals that you've established at the organization level down to the individual so that they can see how they're contributing to overall organizational success. And then there's other types of assessments that you might do, like a skills assessment, for example, if your gaps are identified to be skill-based, that you can address through those types of interventions.
Now we have a question here from Twitter. The question reads thus: change is easy when driven by top managers. But what about change mobilized from the bottom up? Which is more sustainable?
From my perspective, I think that you need both. I've seen organizations where change is pushed by top management and other staff aren't on board, and eventually there's a revolt, there's a revolution because people don't support it. I've also seen situations where people, so to speak, on the bottom are trying to drive changes and push changes up, and I've also seen that fail. So I think that the best scenario is when you have both sides on target to change. And what Wendy talked about earlier in terms of our change management methodologies, is that you don't always start with both. You don't always start in that ideal situation. Usually it's one or the other that's leading. What we need to do is get the other on board as quickly as possible. And a lot of the change management tools that Deloitte have and that exist generally in the industry are very good at doing this. I think the challenge is that we don't usually give it the attention that it deserves.
Right, and I think part of that paradigm shift is really ensuring that when programs are being designed, that there is an explicit emphasis and call for change management activities as part of the capacity building and performance improvement efforts, so that we're strategically thinking about these things and we're being asked to as we implement these programs. And so, when you're doing a stakeholder analysis, for example, that's where you will identify who needs to be involved in this change and where they are in terms of their own ideas about the change. So you can develop those change agents throughout the organization at all levels, because as Molly said, it isn't just the top and it isn't just the so to speak, bottom of the organization, but it's really having change agents throughout that are playing specific roles in communicating messages and taking actions that are going to help facilitate the changes that the organization needs to make.
Thanks for that. And talking about change, there's been a lot of questions submitted today about that that issue as well as the tactics. But I wondered what changes should be promoted among donors to better promote capacity building, particularly among national and local institutions.
I think that one of the most important things that donors can do is to hold implementers accountable for outcome level change. And donors have an amazing opportunity to create outcome level indicators when they issue a request for proposal. And they also, as a donor community, can help drive the standardization of outcome level capacity and performance indicators. So if they're putting that into our scopes of work, we'll be held accountable for it, and we'll make sure that it happens. If they continually fall back on what's easy and what's quick, then maybe we'll do it or maybe we won't. But it's not guaranteed. It won't be a priority for us. I think the other thing that donors can do is to make sure that they're aligning their objectives with the objectives and the mandate of the Counterpart Institute. And I know that a lot of donor organizations have a standard process to do this, and they engage the counterpart as a rule. But I think sometimes it doesn't always end up, for various reasons. They aren't always able to focus on what the counterpart cares about. So I think if they made that more of a priority, made sure that it happened, and made sure that the goals were aligned at the end, that would certainly help our situation.
And I would add to that I think the donors are really instrumental in making this paradigm shift in the ways that Molly described, but also additionally, as we've talked about, I think in designing the programs, pay attention to change management and some of these human capital ideas and solutions that can be brought to bear that promote sustainability within an organization. So help equip leaders to lead their organizations and to manage change so that these changes can be sustained. And then I would also say that donors can take the lead in changing the dialogue so that we're not talking about capacity development, we're talking about sustainable performance improvement. And then that's what all of the implementing partners will be striving for, will be held accountable for, and our counterparts will benefit.
Thanks so much. Now, I realize that time is not on our side at this point, so I'd just like to ask one final question that we've received through the question box, the chat box today, and that is, how does Cypress differ substantially from OCAT or OCAT, which was developed by ACDI and McKinsey? A slightly mischievous question there.
but it's a really good one, Richard, an important one. The OCAT, from what I know, the Organizational Capacity Assessment Tool, is an assessment tool, and in that way it's similar to the maturity model and benchmarking assessment tool that we use. And it's really important, and I've used it, and I've used the COCAT and the TOCAT and other CATs as well. They're all good and they're all useful. I think what distinguishes Cypress is that Cypress is an overall methodology. It's not just an assessment tool. So in Cypress, as we talked about, the first thing that we do is an interactive session on what the performance goals are, not in the context of the project or in the context of the assessment that we're about to conduct, but what are their overall mandates, what keeps them up at night, what do they care about, what are they being held accountable for. And then in that context, we deliver the assessment tool. And I think the assessment tool is flexible. You could do OCAT or COCAT or the MMBT or any assessment tool you wanted, as long as it's focused on those performance targets. And then beyond that assessment, we have methodologies for developing the work plan, for implementing different solutions that are part of that work plan, and for measuring and using the data that's generated over the course of the project. And as Wendy said, change management and performance management are baked into all of that. Right. So Cypress is really a methodology and not just a tool.
But to address the question about the tool itself, when we were developing the maturity model benchmarking tool, we did exhaustive research on the tools that were out there and available, and really evaluated where there might be gaps and address those through the maturity model benchmarking tool. And so it is different than the OCAT and other tools in some very fundamental and key ways. And there are ways that promote sustainability, sustainable performance. Now, Molly's saying starting with the performance goals, absolutely, that's a key part of the process. But the tool itself, number one, it's performance-based. So what that means is that the way that the maturity levels are described in the continuum for each of the organizational parameters talks about performance. It talks about what an organization, how an organization is able to perform at that level of maturity. It doesn't talk about them, do I have a standard operating procedure? Do I have a policy in place? It's not a checklist in that way, because we all know that having a process doesn't mean it's being followed. It doesn't mean that you're able to perform. And so the tool really focuses on performance in that way, which is quite different than the others we've seen. Also, the concept of leading edge is quite different. So Molly described the top end of the spectrum is really leading edge for any organization around the globe. And what that opens up for our counterparts is a view into the possibilities, a view into what's out there in the world where they might be very, not have insight into what other organizations are doing. And so that, it opens up the possibility for them to choose their future. So the implementing partners aren't saying, you should look like this, or you should do that. They're able to make the choice and then identify the actions to put in place to address them. It's also tailored, and it links directly to a performance improvement plan. And so in those key ways, it's very different than the other tools that are out there.
And that's the maturity model tool versus other assessment tools that are in the industry. But the overall Cypress methodology is a much broader methodology, and that performance theme flows throughout, and the change management theme flows throughout. And I think that's the differentiator between just having an assessment tool which most organizations have, and that often happens, versus having an overall start-to-finish methodology that starts with those performance targets and weaves that all the way through.
Fascinating insight. Thanks so much to Wendy and Molly there. Now, I just really wanted to thank both of you and also my DevEx colleagues, and to you, our webinar listeners from across the globe, for joining us today. We hope that we've at least answered some of your questions about the new paradigm for capacity development. And as valued DevEx members, we just want to make sure that you're getting everything you can out of your DevEx membership. So I know we weren't able to answer all of your questions. We received many today. So if you do have a question that we didn't have time to answer, please email us at webinars@devex.com. That's webinars@devex.com, and we'll do our best to get back to you as soon as we can. And if you'd like to watch the webinar again, we'll be posting it next week on the devex.com website as community content, so stay tuned for that. And all that remains for me to say on behalf of DevEx and all my colleagues here is thank you for joining us today. And I hope that you'll join us again soon for our next DevEx webinar. Thank you and have a good day.